Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to Common Ground for organizing it on a weekend when I'm meant to be marking exams and doing other things. It was really nice to look at this material and to remember, actually, that there's a world there. So thank you for that. So this is a real education, learning from anti-colonial struggles. And I wrote a little bit about what I wanted to write about as a way of encouraging me to do it. And so I'm just going to read that out because I've come at it through a lot of videos and a PowerPoint, and I don't know if it's all going to come off, yeah? So I'll talk through the bits that don't. But let me just start with flagging the kind of issues at stake, or how I see them. So how would campaigners, both students and faculty, agree on what decolonization actually means, or achieve unity in their aims and strategies while protecting precious differences? Everybody can hear me fine? Is that all right? Yeah. How do universities engage with change and campaigners safeguard against a process that asserts or adopts more comfortable imperial pasts, while others remain concealed? Which principles apply to the subjects of fields or events or geographic locations to be addressed that would avoid competing among sufferings, an emphasis only on colonial practices and recounting imperial evils, or producing ceaseless stories from the South that are deracinated from their temporal and spatial histories of struggle and their collective nature? The answer to these questions are to be found in a vast repository of anti-colonial struggles, in the words and especially in the practices of those who directly fought for liberation and equality and against imperialism and colonialism. They did this by relying on common principles and building a true solidarity with all those facing this common predicament. They had a language and a form of struggle that was remarkably creative in dealing with empire. So in other words, in order to move forward, we simply need to open the road behind us. Now, how do we do that? Yeah, there's a number of roads which I'd like to open, historical, that all can help us answer those questions. Now, if a French philosopher wrote, and I'm sure you'll know who it is when I say the quote, "The successful exercise of power is proportional to its ability to hide its own mechanisms." It's Foucault, of course, right? Most of Britain's colonial past remains invisible and cut off from its relationship to present-day racism and prejudice. Today's inequalities, not merely social and economic, but above all civic in its old-fashioned and proper sense, political equality. So what do I mean by this? So let's start opening one road. There are no hard facts in today's school of Britain's precise role in the regions that remain highly active sites of colonial violence, the Arab, Asian, African, and Muslim worlds, nor how its pervasive present continues to shape us. Educating British institutions and those individuals in it, like our police force or our faculty, of unconscious bias, was an approach developed to address the invisible to most system of institutional racism after the findings of the Stephen Lawrence. I got a picture of him because it's such, oh, I've got to find, here we go. There he is. After the findings of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the Macpherson report, Stephen was a young 18-year-old who was killed in a racist attack while waiting for a bus in South London in 1993. I think he was 18, maybe 19. The case became the highest profile racial killing in UK history. Its legacy was profound, with cultural changes to attitudes on racism in the police, to the law and to political practice, with its 70 recommendations for reform of national institutions and law, both criminal and we have the Race Act, yeah? 2 of the perpetrators were convicted only 20 years later in 2012. Some of you who were here last year met his mother, Dorothy. She came and gave a lecture here. In 1967, Stokely Carmichael, in a book called Black Power, explained how institutional racism originates. He says it originates in the operation of established and respected forces in the society, and thus receives far less public condemnation than he was talking about individual racism. And then he goes on to give various examples. In the McPherson report, it is defined as this: the collective failure of an organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, and behavior which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. So the rationale of introducing people to their unconscious and invisible bias was basically to wake them up from their cultural coma, which the current diet of history, culture, and race that our national school curriculum has reduced them to. For in spite of the imaginative dedication of our teachers, and in spite of the numerous failed forays into government committees by groups of civic-minded historians, we still teach the Second World War as the seminal moment of British foreign engagement with the world outside this island. Some dedicated colleagues at the moment in our history faculty are actually preparing new materials on colonial history to be introduced in today's school curriculum. Quite a heroic task given previous attempts. Yeah? So, and they have a teach-in on Tuesday morning at the history faculty in which they're doing that. So they're doing a number of things to try and push this. There's a number of fantastic colleagues there that are really organizing. They're going to take on the national curriculum system yet again. I'm staying out of that one. Now, this system of education, with its crude but effective division-making machine, maybe it's better with yes, division-making machines, manufactures a cloak of utter invisibility, where citizens simply cannot see that others are living as subjects, and it works extremely well. When you're in, you're in. The invisibility of who's out of this class of subjects makes any individual, black, brown, immigrant, refugee, British student, over-visible. Walking down the street, waiting for a bus, in a tutorial, eating in hall, we all become highly conspicuous. It is impossible not to feel alone in such circumstances. Now, Stephen Lawrence's death made the visible, and that's structural racism, suddenly visible. But now I'd like to talk to you about a completely different Lawrence, who played a substantial role in instituting this violent and invisible framework right here at home. For if the engine room of this division-creating colonial machine is anywhere, it is Oxford, where empire's intellectual distillation and industrial production began. Let me show you this picture which haunts me. There it is. After moving here to work on my doctorate, I lived in a Balliol College flat in North Oxford, where I still live. Some old friends lived nearby, not more than 100 yards away. To get to them, I needed to cross at Woodstock Road. Right there, on the corner of Woodstock, is the very ordinary brick house with the blue plaque, marking where T.E. Lawrence, that is Lawrence of Arabia, grew up, from where he went to school, and then Jesus College, and from where he began his career as a college scholar at Magdalen, mapping and surveying vast swathes of Arab land that very soon ended up in British hands. And yes, there is a connection. He was learning Arabic, and he was busily extracting Hittite loot of 6th and 7th centuries BC from the dig near Aleppo in Syria to gift to his mentor and patron Hogarth, then keeper at the Ashmolean. At the rear of the house was a shed built by his father, where he would return after his involvement later to write the early drafts of that epic and extraordinary text, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, where he spent years writing, drafting, and rewriting his own role in the Arab Revolt. It is very difficult to describe the set of emotions that Lawrence, that colonial master, inspires in people from the region, in particular from Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, and the complex set of talents that he had, which cannot but set off a certain admiration for his free and restless spirit, his back-breaking, fastidious work, his moments of terrible awareness of what he was doing. Now, during those early decades of the 20th century, precious artifacts of ancient Palestine, Iraq, Syria could suddenly be found on a shelf in his Clouds Hill cottage in Dorset, piled in the storerooms at the Ashmolean or the British Museum in London, lying half forgotten in the back of a dusty walnut display cabinet at All Souls, where they still lie. There you go. And it goes without saying that Palestine itself was never returned to us. Lawrence's undergraduate thesis was, of course, on the Crusaders and their castles in France and Greater Syria. Lawrence, as the exemplar of British Empire, perfectly embodies that intimate and violent extremism of British foreign policy, a policy that still holds in its relations to the Arabs to this day. Edward Said once pointed out the awareness with which Lawrence wrote about himself, self-defining the irreconcilable and incommensurable aspects of his person as a standing civil war. Now, Colonel T.E. Lawrence contributed more than most to these policies today. Part of his genius was to wed this colonial two-tiered machine to a scholarly fascination with technique, creating highly detailed military manuals on exactly how to disappear, destroy, and dispossess native peoples, or strafe bomb strategically located villages in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, this manual is still studied by British officers that were recently sent to fight in Afghanistan. Today's drone policy began here with All Souls fellow T.E. Lawrence, our own Lawrence of Arabia. While he designed, carried out, and then perfected these methods, he was also no slouch at slipping outside this role to regularly castigate and criticize their value in true standing civil war style, from Syria or Iraq, and later India after the First World War. He wrote extensive daily reflections from his distant outpost airbase to his pals Nancy Astor, or G.B. Shaw, or Robert Graves, or the commander of the Air Force, or to Churchill, pointing out to them that bombing villages from the sky on the borders of Afghanistan was never going to get these victims on side with British colonial policy. He would put these letters in the post bag at his base before heading off to work, preparing the bombing planes for their runs. Afterwards, writing up possible technical improvements to the machines or to the bombing strategy. His air manual was indeed a masterpiece. As Little Hart described it, the best ever written. Now, here at Oxford, people are beginning to learn about the exact road that Rhodes and other notables such as Lawrence played in annihilating, destroying, dismembering, fragmenting indigenous peoples, and ravaging, of course, their countries. Under what violent conditions the treasures and fragments of the souls of Africa, Asia, and the indigenous peoples of Australia and the Americas, the Arab and Muslim worlds, got into our museums. Now, Oxford students, oh, that's his camera, which is at the pits. This is, I didn't want to show any more Lawrence loot, but this is actually the camera that he used. He was, when he was mapping. So you can find that in the Pitts Rivers. Now, Oxford students, such as the Invisible History Workshop, of which some of the members are invisibly here, have begun to research for themselves the role that such imperial notables such as Amory, Cornwallis, Milner, Rhodes, Hogarth, and Lawrence played, along with the adroit intellectual shift to instill and value these particular colonial practices. It can best be illustrated when the Oxford classicist in the second half of the 19th century, towards the end, decided that the curriculum should move from the study of Athens to the study of Rome. As one engineer of this Oxford education system of invisibility wrote, "There are more important things than freedom." And this is a system that trained generations of young men at Oxford to do such things while not looking and not seeing what they did. So nothing much on that, in a sense, has changed. Much of the invisibility is still with us. How do we make it visible? In my own case, walking by Lawrence's house to the bus each day, when finishing my doctorate, teaching undergraduates, discovering the curriculum, I still don't teach the Middle East option, I'll tell you that, was to try and create something I recognized as part of the world I knew, but was then utterly invisible. And that's how I opened the road behind me, so I could become part of this place. So I'm going to see if I can do this. I'm going to try and take you to the site. Let's see. There we go. Can you see? Yeah, there it is. Now, this is something that took us, a large body of people, 7 years, I would say at least. Yeah, 7 years to do. And it's not finished yet, even though it's up. That's why it's got that orange thing at the side that says beta. This is a bilingual Arabic-English online learning resource that explores Palestinian revolutionary practice and thought from the Nakba of 1948 to the siege of Beirut in 1982. So it covers 34 years. It was a period that was characterized by a revolutionary culture, and it was expressed in particular practices and forms of thought. It also was an era that witnessed the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of refugees, Palestinians, Arabs, international volunteers, inside and outside of Palestine. These revolutionary cadres built dynamic popular movements and created structures with substantial political, military, and cultural capacities, launching a classic armed liberation struggle that counts as a landmark anti-colonial movement of the 20th century. Alongside its fraternal older Algerian movement, the Palestinian Revolution was to the Arab world and the broader Middle East what the Vietnamese Revolution was to Southeast Asia, the South African to Africa, the Cuban to Latin America. It had strong fraternal connections to these other revolutions, cooperated intimately with them on several levels, and shared both outlook and language of anti-colonial and anti-imperial liberation struggles of Africa, Asia, Latin America. Now, this digital resource is not an archive, an encyclopedia, or a gazetteer, so it's not aimed at collecting all of these documents. There's more than, I think, nearly 350. There will be 400 in each side, the Arabic and English side. And it provides this curriculum, which is here, but it also takes you to some of the, oh, it's not going to take you down. How do we do this? Let's see. Nope. Okay, at the bottom of this page is a lot of videos that are subtitled. Is that my phone or your phone? No? Where is it? So, this curriculum gives you a number of questions, but it answered a question for me. I mean, it gives you a number of answers, but it answered a particular question for me and for my colleagues that work with me on it. How do you bring the experience and voices of a liberation movement in particular and anti-colonial revolutions in general into the curriculum? This had emerged from the awareness that I mentioned of the void we had noticed as educators interested in teaching. The phenomena that is usually referred to as the Palestinian Revolution was momentous, by any standard. Unfolding over the course of several decades, it had profound implications for the history of Palestine, the Middle East, and global anti-colonialism. But we couldn't find a single course specifically dedicated to this subject. So in Arab institutions, in the Arab world, it's usually the Palestinian cause is taught under, while in Europe and the United States, it's generally features under the Arab-Israeli conflict courses. And around these syllabi and these subjects, dozens of textbooks, readers, documentary source collections have been developed. Now, as much as they provide valuable teaching material, they also restrict what can be taught and learned, and especially what can be understood. Their emphasis is on top-down, state, diplomatic, military themes in history and politics, as well as overarching economics, social superstructures, and you get into conflict resolution. But in all of these perspectives, do you know where this? I think it's here. Yes? But in all of these approaches, the Palestinian people are seen as objects of politics, objects of history. Teaching the Palestinian Revolution, on the other hand, opens up different possibilities. By necessity, it is centered on the Palestinian people themselves rather than on the great powers, regional states, impersonal, international, or structural forces that had intervened so pervasively in their lives. While taking into account the role of external historical forces, the focus here is entirely on Palestinian popular structures, movements, cadres, philosophies, songs, poetry, art, tactics, and strategies. What the course therefore explores is the development of collective agency, political production, and active engagement with history. It also, of course, examines the transnational connections that bound the Palestinian Revolution tightly with other anti-colonial struggles and solidarity movements. So I'm going to move on, because this is it will let me go down now? Well, it's just to show you, let's see. Yep, so here you can find, we've just subtitled a few of them, and you can go on, but another place you can find, I mean, there's hundreds of hours, actually, and Learn is a kind of a different way to go through it. It's got, you know, founding, joining, mobilizing, revolutionary moments, revolutionary culture, and the weeks go through 12 different themes. It's kind of like start on a classic history Oxford thing where there's like lots of sources, and we've done it in hyperlinks. So there's actually teaching essays because we couldn't find anything, again, on this subject. And this teaching resource is available through Creative Commons and can be used by universities, by students. It's free for anybody to learn from it. A number of people are taking it up. The history faculty, there's a couple of faculty that are going to teach it here. And there's a master's at SOAS, so some people are taking certain of the weeks to use that because we've got 12 like the normal. And of course, in Palestine, in Lebanon, most of our young people, Palestinians, don't go to university, can't go to university. So there's an institute there. So there's something where in the refugee camps, they're bringing and doing evening classes with the course. Yeah, so they can retrieve their own history. But it's also, I've got colleagues in my department that because of self-determination or other issues, you can find sources. Because one of the questions in Opening the Road Behind You, if you want to tell a story of the people themselves, where do you find it, right? It's a big, it's a long campaign, this, yeah? And as students, you can demand it, but you don't have the time to actually go and find it, yeah, necessarily. So I think the pressure was on us to do that, and that's what I've been doing the last 7 years. So, I mean, there's some other things I'd like to talk about in this, but I think because we started a bit late, and there's something about the cadres and how you retrieve that, and I can answer it in questions, or at some point I'm actually going to we're going to disseminate this when it's finished, when we've got the final documents up and we do the rollout. So there'll be a proper kind of thing in that. But I'd like to go on to something, the next bit. So, how do we make this city our city? A guided tour could point out the site of the infamous Balliol Kindergarten, not the day nursery in the flat below me, but rather that group of late 19th century fellows and former students who ran Empire from the college, along with the All Souls Roundtable group. Why do we need to know that side as well? Yeah, there's different roads you can open. One is the colonial story. It's not to bring a colonial legacy into view in order just to know your villains, yeah? Although it is certainly good to know them. Nor is it to remain victims, I would say, or to make others feel guilty, or to make a hierarchy of identities and who suffered most. It is to begin to make visible the reason why some parts of the world are the way they are, and why everyone from there, the world there, is pretty angry, and why refugees are drowning today in the sea, trying to get to a safe shore, and why some of you feel so invisible here, students of this city, in this university, where you study, where you sleep, where you learn, where you make yourselves part of the world. Students, and yes, a lot of staff, and even some faculty. Imperial legacy and present inequalities. We can see this connection. Britain has another long, invisible history. This is the last of the roads behind, I think I'm going to draw, which is as a host to refugees and those fleeing political persecution. The scholar Shlomo Sand has shown us between 1880 and 1915, around 2.5 million Jews from Russia and Eastern Europe, the equivalent to 10 million refugees today, emigrated to Western Europe and North America. Those landing here facing the same fear-based discrimination we see today. And as we know, Turks escaping some of the empire's laws, Spanish Republicans fleeing Franco's killers, make up our modern Tory party's lineage. And next week, I didn't do it. Oh, I know why I didn't do it. Okay, let's go back here. Next week, on the 15th, under its remarkable new director, Laura van Broekhoven, who I think is here. Yes, she is. Director of the Pitts Rivers Museum, is launching a series of invisible histories. And I think you're speaking tomorrow, yeah? Yeah. So this is something that is Identities Without Borders, but there's another fantastic thing called Mind the Gap, which is about invisible histories of refugees here, and that's coming up when? The week after next? Yeah, which is about the history of Oxford and the refugees who were driven from here and the refugees who came here and made this their city as well. So, you know, this, I talked before about, you know, we don't, if we're not victims, what are we? Here's an example. This is a, is it start the 15th or it starts the 16th then? Because I think the opening is on the 15th.
No, the 15th is the opening. It's all that you can already see.
Okay. This is Yarmouk refugee camp. I don't know how many of you have seen this picture, but it's a kind of iconic picture of the siege of Yarmouk. We have 500,000 Palestinian refugees there from 1948, and they were under siege. And this is the one UNRWA van that got in with a bit of supply. But there's other ways to make something other than this image visible. I'm going to talk about one of the students that used to be here. I'm going to talk about two of the students. One who now works, who came and did a master's here, and he's now working at something called Migrants Organize. Akram Salhab, who some of you know. He did a master's thesis on the great Chartist organizing history in this country and political theory, MPhil. And he's now at Migrants Organise in London, and he set up a registration drive for this election. That was just 2 days ago, for refugees and migrants in this country. And they did a thing at the Young Vic, and I filmed some of those. They filmed some of those. That's Migrants Organise, and that's the vote, promote the vote for migrants. Now, I'm going to see if I can play you just a little minute of, okay, all clips. No sound, huh? Okay, so I'm not going to play you some clips, but I'll tell you, let me see if I can escape out of that. Yeah, there was a really amazing set of, where are we? Here we go. Can someone, how do I get back onto this? We don't know. Yep. Just here? Yeah, I saw it. Brilliant. But I'm too far down. Okay, here we go. This one, and then here we go. So, he opened a tradition that he belonged to that had its history, and he discovered it actually reading about the British Chartists in this country. Yeah, because there's something about that universalism of struggle, and now serves registering migrants to vote, and I'm sure they did it. I'm sure they did it, right, Jonas? Yeah. So if we open the road behind us, we can also discover our own anti-colonial tradition right here in Oxford, which is another way. Last century's critics of colonialism campaigned against the role of empire abroad explicitly in terms of workers, oppressions, and inequalities at home. Now, one such person I just wanted to introduce you to, which is to close with the final, because he's so fantastic, is Palmer Dutt, a Balliol undergraduate. There he is. And a former undergraduate student of ours, Aiden, who went on to do a master's at IR here a couple of years ago, and is now a somewhat triumphant Labour councillor in part of South London, he too found his own tradition here at Oxford in the work and life of a previous student, Rajani Palmer Dutt. I'm going to just give you a little bit about Dutt. He was born in 1896 and was regarded as the most brilliant Marxist analyst in the English-speaking world, and the leading force behind the party's intellectual clout. He built his reputation as a theoretician through his work. Yeah? Prolific pamphleteer, essayist, best known for his famous Notes of the Month in the Independent Labour Monthly. So his thought was framed by his anti-imperialism, which played a leading role in his analysis of international affairs. He was born to Anna Palmer, a Swedish writer, and Upendra Krishna Dutt, an Indian doctor. He grew up in the working class district in Cambridge. In 1914, he won a scholarship to Balliol College to read classics. When war broke out, he immediately joined the Labour Party and threw himself into anti-war politics within an incredibly hostile environment of the city and the university, as you can imagine, if any of you have read a little bit about what it was like at the beginning of the First World War and the mood. Witnessing the jingoistic calls for wars by students and staff, Dutt describes this feeling, and I quote, and this is from Aiden's MPhil thesis. He said, "Disillusionment with the hollowness of the official bourgeois academic claims and theories during my apprenticeship at Oxford." In Dutt's speech notes for an Oxford Union debate as a student, he argued that, and this is Dutt again, "my own cosmopolitan anti-national point of view Neither will allow the other to remain a first-class power, no matter what may happen to itself, and thus there will be no peace while Britain remained an imperial power. In 1916, he was imprisoned for refusing the draft, later being discharged and allowed to return to his studies on condition that he tried, and this is a quote, never to enter the army again. In 1917, it goes on, it gets better, Dutt was expelled from Oxford for hosting a meeting entitled Socialism and War, where he had declared the necessity of a second socialist revolution in Russia. Now, what had actually happened was right-wing students had tried to break up the meeting, smashed some windows, and Dutt was blamed. His tutor was A.D. Lindsay, a Fabian who identified as a socialist and a proponent of academic freedom of speech. And he had the final say on his expulsion. Dutt was allowed back to Oxford only to sit his examinations, where he got the highest first out of his entire cohort. I know, it's sweet, isn't it? In 1950, in a letter to the editor of the Balliol College Register, he asked for his sending down in 1917 to be put on the record of his alumni record. He said, "I should be sorry to see a mere tedious recital of commonplace examinations without reference to the highest honor which Oxford of the present era can bestow on an honest Democrat." So I'm just going to give you one quote from Dutt so you can just get the flavor of the man. Okay, this is something from his writings. He wrote several books, and you can look him up. He's quite an extraordinary man. Labor leaders speak of the empire as a great commonwealth of nations, a federation of our brothers and cousins across the sea, as bringing peace and justice and free institutions to backwards peoples. He's got this in quotes. They are speaking of the dominions of Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, settlements which have either wiped out entirely with the utmost cruelty the original populations of the territory they have seized, as in Canada and Australia, or enslave them, as in South Africa. Now, this still robust and expansive tradition of dissent, radical protest, progress, and sometimes revolution has its own trenchant view of power, and by rights, who should have that power. And it is anti-colonial and anti-imperial at its heart. Often made up of the disenfranchised, always their advocates. They're ready to see through the eyes of the least favored. Or we can say here, through the eyes of the invisible. This position, suggested by thinkers from Du Bois to Fanon, shows us how this is where we must always place our feet, especially if we desire to remain free. Now, Fanon, after joining the Algerian Revolution, let's see who I've got next. Yeah. Wrote a number of things about what solidarity means. He didn't claim his birthright was simply Martinique, that his identity was Afro-Caribbean because he'd been born there, nor did he say that his identity was as a returning continental African when he went to Algeria. But he wrote instead as an active and engaged cadre in the Algerian Revolution and reflecting that role. He said, "My only duty is to avoid renouncing my freedom through my choices. I do not have the right to allow myself to be marred in what the past has determined. I am not the slave of the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors." Solidarity, therefore, is a matter of a freely assumed commitment rather than an automatic orientation inherited by a community. So he says, if the question of practical solidarity with a given past ever arose for me, it did so only to the extent to which I was committed to myself and to my neighbor's fight for all my life and with all my strength, so that never again would a people on earth be subjugated. Through his experience gained through joining and serving in the Algerian Revolution, Fanon sought to make people aware of the potential they had forbidden themselves, of the passivity they paraded in situations where instead what is needed to, and here the final quote, The need is to hold oneself like a sliver to the heart of the world, to interrupt, if necessary, the rhythm of the world, to upset, if necessary, the chain of command, but in any case, and most assuredly, to stand up to the world. Thank you.